Hi, Joe. Thank you so much for being back. You are like back by popular demand because your first two episodes, which I will link in the show notes, have shown up as always in my top 5 when I look at my analytics each month at the end of each year. So I'm excited to have you back, and I have so much that I want to ask you.
I appreciate being here. I think you're somebody that whenever I talk to, I feel like it's there's a person I very much admire, and he said, whenever I meet somebody, I do 3 things. I encounter, learn, evolve. So like taking someone in, learning something, changing. I feel like we do that together very well, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, oh my gosh. Well, likewise, I love all 3 of those things. Definitely happen every time I have a conversation with you. And I think I said this to you the last time, but if your ears are always ringing, it's because I have your book. I'm not really joking when I say this. It's always next to me. And I always do this when I'm doing, like, if I'm on a live on social media, like I do a lot on TikTok because my following is larger there. And in workshops, I'm always sort of referencing your book and holding up your book because I like to make sure people are aware of it and know about it. And
Do you have the
that's what
second
led me to
edition there?
you. I do.
Okay,
I
good.
think this is the second
That,
edition.
that
Yes.
should have all
So,
said.
yeah, I think it's where you shift from the idea of like not a timeout, but instead of looking at a break, and you change a little bit of, I think there were some updates in terms of some of the language that you had used, but I love, love, love the book. I use it all the time. I recommend it all the time. So I thought for today's episode, what might be helpful is if we just sort of dove into some of the bigger topics that both you and I are seeing come across our way. I know you work with families, I work with families,
Right.
and I thought I could kind of pick your brain on some of the things that I'm seeing, and I'd love to get your perspective on it. And I know a lot of the families listening will feel the same way. Does that sound okay?
Absolutely.
Okay, so right before we started recording, you and I both sort of excitedly shared that we love sort of thinking about or talking to families about this idea of play deprivation. And I think
Right.
I recently posted something that it's really important to make sure we're letting kids play independently every single day. And that the problem that I usually hear or what I run into is most parents will say, my child won't play alone. They literally ask me every 5 seconds to play with them. If I don't, I feel guilty. If I say I'm busy or I have to do something, they just sit there and wait for me.
Right.
So, which is, I think, probably a common experience that a lot of families are having. So, can we just unpack it a little bit of why is play deprivation a problem, meaning they're not getting enough time playing independently? Why do kids need it, and how can we foster environments where it's more available to them?
Right. So let's look first at what they're talking about when they say play deprivation. So the play deprivation they're talking about is time when children are playing primarily with other children, sometimes alone, but they're not in earshot or eye shot of parents. It's not just in the same room. They're talking about children off on their own, dealing with problems. Okay. Typically, it might even be it might be 5 minutes to run home. We're talking about kids on their own. Okay. So what that is, and the best way to think about that is that's self-managed time. Okay. And this is very important because self-managed time is the antithesis of what parents have been taught to do for the last 20 years, which is manage time, manage conflict, manage emotions, manage regulation, manage boundaries, manage the day, manage the entertainment, the activities, manage, manage, manage. So
Yes.
literally what that research is saying is that the nature of the time that how we've taught parents to be with children is counterproductive to their mental health.
Yeah.
so
Right.
so that's a big deal. So and then the problems with that is that the straightforward solution that we know works is giving that kind of time. But that's really hard for parents. You can't all of a sudden feel safe about the street you live on and the kids that your kid might play with and go out and play for an hour. For a lot of parents, that's a really difficult and thing to do or impossible thing to do given the change in how our communities is. So there's your first problem, and and the next problem is that that actually the nature of our interactions has to change. So I'm very interested in how is it about how we parent that epitomizes the things that are the opposite of what they need, and how can we make it more like what they need?
Mm-hmm.
So how do children play with each other that's so different and so healthy that we can incorporate into our parenting?
Yes,
Okay.
perfect.
So for me, like a simple thing with that story that comes to mind is there was a boy that I used to see every weekend for weeks on end, and I would see him for a couple hours, and his mother was a single mom, and so I would spend a lot of time playing with him. And initially, I would play things he wanted to play, and then one day, I was just I just didn't want to play what he played, or I wanted to play differently. He said, I want to, let's play action figures. I'm Batman, you're Robin. And I said, no, I don't want to be Robin. He says, no, I'm always Batman. You got to be Robin. I'm Batman. And I said, well, I don't want to be Batman. I want to be Batman. You're not Batman. And he said, no, look, Robin has this great tool belt and he does all these different things. And I'm like, look, you can't fool me about Batman. He's the better guy. I want to be Batman. And we had a kind of argument. And I said, look, it's fine. You don't want to let me be Batman. But if you're not letting me be Batman, I'm not going to play with you. I'm going to do something with your mom. Okay. That's how children play with each other. They're not, they're not accommodating every single direction. They have conflict. It happens naturally. It happens over who likes Batman. Everybody prefers Batman. They're having that fight. Eventually, he came to me a couple of minutes later, and he negotiated a solution. I think he offered, first you can be Batman but just for 5 minutes, and then I'm Batman. And I'm like, no, we're going to play for half an hour, so I need to be Batman for half the time. And then he's like, look, I'll let you be Batman first, but you only get to be for 10 minutes because you're first, and I'll be Batman for 20 minutes. I'm like, okay, deal. That is a social skills class in action.
Yes.
Okay, if your kid's obnoxious, he doesn't know how to play with other kids, that wouldn't be the case if he could play alone with them, because he'd have to solve that problem. So when he's playing disrespectfully with you, you have to go, look, I don't want to play right now. We'll try again in half an hour, and walk away so they have that experience. But we just want to enrich that time, that it becomes completely unnatural time that they need to develop.
I love that. I mean, as a speech and language pathologist, you're singing to my heart, because, social skills is a big part of what we do as kids start to get even a little bit older. And it's amazing, the management part, even from a therapeutic standpoint. I can't tell you how many classes I had in graduate school and in my fellowship year when I was in the field, where it was like, tell them what to say, give them the scripts to use every single time. Create, and there is value in a social story. There is value in allowing these different sort of space, like these different ways of teaching something. But at the same time, until they experience the struggle and then have to look within to figure out how they want to solve it, that's when they really start to create meaningful change. It isn't in my repetitious story of, hey, remember that one time when so-and-so said this to somebody else and that person felt sad and then that other person did, it's like, it's just not the same value. It doesn't carry the same weight in the world of a child. So I remember one time I was working with a little girl, and she was struggling at school to speak up or to say when things were bothering her within a social context. And so instead of just doing the traditional, like, let me pull out a social story and talk to her about how she can speak her needs and say what she needs to say, she knew all of that. She just struggled in that moment. I sort of contrived an environment where I was kind of tapping on her chair, which I knew annoyed her. So it wasn't harmful, but I knew it was just enough that I wanted her to get to the point. I wanted to see what she did when she felt annoyed, and did she keep it in? Did she distract? Like, what was her process to work through it? And then I said to her, does it bother you that I'm tapping your chair? And then she looked up and she said to me, yes. And I said, I want you to say it to me. Don't worry about, I'm an adult, don't worry, I want you to say to me exactly what you're feeling. Right. And she said to me, I really want you to stop tapping my chair because the noise bothers me. And I said, okay, no problem. So again, and then even her mom said later that day, you know what, I said it, and she didn't get upset, and she listened. And I think I can start doing that at school with this child or this child. So I think sometimes we are looking for always sort of what I call verbal prompts or explanations to teach. We're always looking to teach in this very overt way instead of just allowing sometimes. Like, what is a way, like exactly how you're saying, like you wanted to be like a peer to this boy and talk to him the same way his peer would talk to him. Like, I'm not playing that game anymore, you know?
Right.
Instead of putting on the adult hat and kind of going into teaching mode, you wanted to elicit the same experience that would give him the feeling of, well, I got to solve this now. What do I need to do?
Yeah, and this is just generationally, this might have that approach of explaining and scripting and doing those pieces might have worked 50 years ago when the time with your parents was super valuable because they didn't have a lot of it and they were working, and you had some fear in terms of the boundaries, and so you were desperate for that time and you were eager for it and you were listening, but that the playing field has changed radically. We've empowered our children. This is what raising lions means. We've raised lions. Lions want to do it themselves. Lions want to solve problems. Every time that you give them information that they could have figured out themselves or they already knew, you steal from them the moment of autonomy, of asserting things. It's like one of the first things every child says is, I do it. I do it. Okay? Every time you explain to them, you've stolen the I do it moment. Okay. And when you steal that and you give information, their only way to assert power is to feign inability. And that's a passive tantrum. So now, instead of having an ability and an identity based on asserting who they are and participating, they develop an identity based on withdrawing power, withdrawing ability, and getting you to do the work for them, the compensation. So that giving them scripts is a perfect example of I want them to write the script. I want them to have that moment. And what you said about contriving a moment is brilliant, right? It's like, let's create, that's our job as parents, is how do we create a situation for them to step into that autonomously with a solution or struggle through a frustration. Don't move the frustration. Don't offer that solution. Create that place. Make it kind, but hold it firm and allow that frustration to happen until they come to that place. You need to solve that problem.
Absolutely. I love that. And I love, it's a reframe on autonomy too, because I think when most parents hear autonomy, they hear give choices, give a lot of choices. If you give a lot of choices, that's practicing autonomy. And I think that's their go-to. So the second the child, let's say, pushes against a boundary, a parent will say, okay, well, would you rather have this or that? And there's a little bit of then offering multiple things, right? Let's say it's, you can't have this toy, but you can have this, this, and this, and this, right? So there's always, or there's just constant asking of what do you want in terms of a choice of things that are pretty inconsequential to the child. So now all of a sudden they're constantly deciding everything. Right. And that's just not reality either. That's just not how their world, we're not really setting them up to solve problems, right?
Right. And I think, and the other thing that I think people underestimate is that, or maybe they don't even understand, is that the truth is that children need to feel your will. They need to have an experience of your will, of your need that's different from theirs. And in some ways, particularly for very willful children, aggressive children, dominant children, those children need to feel that you really have things you need and that they have to adjust to that. And once you hold those boundaries, and I'll give you the extreme example, but I hear it all the time. I get parents with very physically aggressive children who I teach to hold that child until they finish tantrum. And that can be a 20-minute hold, that can be a 40-minute hold, where they're holding and waiting until that child processes through that and gives them precisely the kind of regulation they need before they move on. And that first time you do that with a 4-year-old, it can be really emotionally taxing and draining, but I can't count how many parents have told me that in the minutes, hours, and days later, the amount of warmth that they saw from their child and connection after they did that they hadn't seen before. Real expressions of love, of warmth, of feeling more settled. Because there's a recognition, because when you set that boundary and they see that you hold the boundary as fiercely as they challenge the boundary, all of a sudden they're reflected. And when they're reflected and they go, oh, mommy is strong like me and determined like me, the shame about their own action drains away and they feel seen by you because you're
I love that. Yes, I love that. And even when you're saying, that you can respond to it just as fiercely, like I think there is such a fear for parents. Like I always call it, most parents, when they come to me, I'll say that you've arrived to the place of eggshell parenting, which is where you're just walking on eggshells around your more determined child because you're constantly afraid of that, them having a tantrum, fighting you, in some cases, aggressive tantrums, physical outbursts, arguments. And in doing so, I always say they sense and feel, because I always say this, kids sense and feel more than they see and hear. So they're going to sense and feel that there's an anxiousness to you every time they declare their power, every time they, and when you're met with the anxiousness, it just naturally unsettles you too. You don't feel seen in that moment. You just feel like the ground is not really steady underneath you. So there is so much around teaching, even for me, like helping parents understand that like consistency in the boundaries that you're setting plus predictability are two things that really help kids feel safe. From children who are value power to children who value approval, they really want to know, can I predict the environment around me?
Right.
And that breeds more regulation, that allows them to regulate faster because they understand sort of the terms.
And can I say something about attachment? Because you made me think of this. There was an article in the Atlantic Monthly, and I think the title was, this mom thinks you can't parent gently enough, right? Something like that. It was basically about a woman a reporter who spent a day with a gentle parenting expert and basically saw that, the woman is 4 and 7, there were 2 or 3 kids, we're all pretty dysregulated and anxious and upset and not really, the day didn't go well. And at the end she said to the woman who's a parenting coach said, it didn't look like a good day. Things didn't resolve well. They didn't feel regulated. And she says, that's not what I was going for. I was trying to stay attached at every moment through that thing. Okay. And this is a misunderstanding of child development, which is attachment changes. The nature of attachment changes. And from the ages of 2 to the age of 4, children, they come into an awakening of the world. And that awakening means that the nature of attachment changes. Initially, attachment is a oneness. We are one being together. And that's infant. They just need you to satisfy needs, to give them their wants, to comfort them, to manage that. That's the right parenting style for the first year. But then they wake up and they realize, I live in a world of all kinds of different people and wills, and this is confusing, and who's got the power, and how are you like me? And they have to learn through experience that you're like them and that you're separate and it's okay. That means they go through the reproach mom. This is how a conflict looks. Reproach mom means to come together in a new way. In order for that to happen, they have to test that boundary. They need to have a huge tantrum. They need to have that boundary hold. Okay, they're going to try 100 different ways, including emotionally, to move that boundary. Okay, and then what happens is they pull away emotionally. Okay, and the parent in that spot has to let them.
Yeah.
Sometimes this is physically walking away. Sometimes it's emotionally saying, "I hate you," and being you have to allow them to do that. If you allow them to do that, they will solve the problem, and they will come back. And when they come back, the relationship has changed a little, and they've come more into the attachment in the world, from attachment in the womb to the second birth that happens around 2 to attachment in the world. So that process has to happen. And where we short circuit it is we try to stop that emotion, keep that emotion or connection through that process by accommodating and explaining. And we don't allow that process to happen. So essentially we end up with 4 or 5-year-olds who we're still trying to attach to as if they were 9-month-olds. But it's different. They're not 9 months anymore. And that will have it be an anxiety-filled child in the world. because they haven't come into that new comfortable place of awareness that they're one of many.
Yes. Yes. Oh, I love that. That's really great. It's, I think about one of the comments that I get probably the most is like, what are you supposed to do during a tantrum, right? Like there is so much emphasis on the doing to your point around like when they become dysregulated, when they become upset or protest or say, I hate you, you're a bad mom, you're a bad dad, you're a whatever. And like, I don't like it, whatever that looks like, with your child. The most parents sort of feel like my job is to set the boundary, follow through on the boundary, and then stop them from feeling whatever they need to feel about the boundary. But I always say our job is to set the boundary, follow the boundary, let them have the experience of what it is to push up against that boundary and know that they can't change the outcome, and then to work through the feeling that comes up and then be able to regulate themselves before moving on to something else. So it's interesting though, because there is, I think, I don't know. I know certainly when I was growing up, and I think this was the case for a long time, is tantrums, any moment of protest, dysregulation, when a child became upset about a rule that was being set, that's really viewed even still by most parents as poorly behaved kids.
Right.
If you have a child who protests, you have a child who is not a good kid, right? They're not a well-behaved child. And so I think the shame in that for most parents, if that's what you're telling yourself, is that I have to stop this from happening so that my kid is a good kid. My kid is perceived as a well-behaved child. And so we tend to stay stuck on wanting that to get better. Like we have to get them to, so they punish the tantrum, right? If you're going to cry, then you're going to go up in your room and I'm going to shut the door and you're not, I'm going to get away. I'm not talking to you until you're, there's a lot of sort of anger around that expression of emotion. So I'd love to sort of pick your brain and see what you think about that specifically, like the doing aspect and sort of how to help parents maybe reframe that a little bit too.
Yeah, so I think the start of this is that, parenting and culture, it goes in cycles and it's reacting to the thing that happened in the years and, the era before it. Right? And so I think there's an association with boundaries and being negated and losing autonomy. Right? And that perspective, we're reacting against that. So we're either holding boundaries and we're adding judgment and we're adding isolation and lack of connection with the boundary, or we are abandoning the boundary and giving the love and autonomy. And that's because we haven't broken free from the framework of our fathers and our mothers. We're just reacting to it and doing the opposite. Those things don't need to be connected. And so, you say poorly behaved child, I'm like, that's a child who needs something. And don't resent them for wanting it. Even your most aggressive, violent child is trying to resolve a question in their life. Who has power? Who's in charge? Once you understand that that's a question that you have a responsibility to answer, you can hold it more firmly than ever with autonomy and respect. So, that's the break process that I'm teaching people, which is it like, I need you to take a break, and they melt down. No, I don't want to take the break. Look, I can't make you take the break. But if you don't take the break, it gets longer. And if you don't take the longer break, I will hold you until you're ready to take it. I can't make you be ready to take it. And if you need the longest break, maybe even the holding break, then I'm okay with that. If that's what you need. I respect that. So I'm holding a place of expectation, even the nature of the language, of power. And I'm teaching them that I believe they can move into this new space. Because we need to hold the space that they haven't done yet for them to step into it. If we just keep going back to their space and lowering that expectation, they're never going to step in there, or they're always going to rely on us to manage their feelings. So, and that's where you get the anxiousness. So if you can create sort of a faith in their ability to learn and evolve, to encounter, learn, and evolve, like we talked about in the beginning. If we know that they're capable of that, they can learn that they're powerful, autonomous people in the world with other autonomous, powerful people in the world, and they can come into recognition of you, and all those internal things settle. So, and we talked about the dealing with like cuddling and tantrums, and I don't know if you want to jump us off into that, but that's
Yeah, yeah. So we were talking about this a little bit before the recording, and Joe Newman and I slightly disagree on this. So we thought we would have a conversation about this on the podcast because I think it's important. I think it's important to hear other perspectives. And I don't know if I've said this to you before, but I always say to myself, I never completely tether myself to one idea or belief, meaning like I'm always with what I know right now in this very moment, this is how I would advise something. But at the same time, I always leave room for a new understanding, a new way of seeing it. I think we have to, right? And I even applied that when I parented, and still, I mean, my kids are older now, but I wrote an article about it years ago on Medium, and it does really well. And I think it's because the concept is just easy to resonate with. But I always say, adopt the thinking that maybe I'm wrong. Right. And so the more you can walk through life just going, and not like in a weak way, but in a confident way, like, here's what I think, I feel about this, but maybe I'm wrong. And I'm so excited to hear otherwise. So yeah, I think I had done a post about, the question is always, can I hug my child when they're having a tantrum? So before I get into my explanation, I'm dying to hear what you thought.
Right. So, I'll cut to the chase. For me, first of all, if you got a 1.5-year-old, yeah, that's probably not a problem. But if you're having regular tantrums and they're 3 or they're 2.5, and they're very agitated and they're demanding that you cuddle them to calm down, you're acting as the regulation that they need to develop, that they can develop. And the thing is that this is where passive tantrums start. Passive tantrums are feigning inability to assert power and control, and to become dominant or to avoid frustration. Okay. Now it's probably actually the first tantrum that a child really uses that you can call a tantrum, because a 9-month-old isn't having a tantrum. They're having a big demand for something that they want, but it's not about power, and there's not a question in it about who you are. But by 2, there's a question in it, and so a child, it's very natural for the first thing that a child experiments with is, they're saying no, I want a yes. And so what if I pretend like I can't emotionally tolerate this? Because that worked a year ago. That worked 6 months ago when I actually couldn't tolerate it. So the first thing that's natural for them to try is to start to feign inability in various situations and see if that resolves the problem in terms of the new thing they're trying to do, which is dominate you, which is control the whole thing. Now, if a tantrum and dysregulation solves the problem of them exerting power over you, then the question of development is answered that they have power and you don't. They negate you. And if they negate you, they have to control the world, and they're filled with anxiety. So if you're cuddling them in those moments, you're going to have a big problem. You're going to continue that thing, and you're not going to resolve that most important aspect of development, of letting them come into mutual recognition into this new place in the world. So for me, like, if I'm coaching a parent and their 4-year-old is screaming, I need a hug, I need you to hug me, I can't, the response is, hey, I would love to hug you, but I can't hug you until the break's finished. You can decide, and when you're done, well, I'm happy to hug you. I'm always, but you need to when you take a break, the break has to happen first. So I'm going to wait, and when you finish your break, and sometimes that means a child sitting in a chair and they're crying and screaming, and you look, when you're quiet for a minute, then we'll move on. But they're sitting in the chair and they're listening to you. So for me, that's where I'm holding this expectation. I'm holding a reality of their capacity to move into the world so that they can move into the world, and so that the feigning inability and them trying to draw back into infancy where they had no responsibility isn't successful. I'm holding a safe space for them to move into.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I really appreciate that. And I don't think I completely disagree with what you're saying. I didn't think you would. I thought,
we have a lot of,
Yeah, I think for me, the way I framed it in that video is, and this is a little bit in the sort of context of what I believe a tantrum is, right? So I was started off by saying that, first we have to answer that question, let's back up a little bit and understand what a tantrum usually is or when it happens. And it's usually the result of your child not getting something they want or facing an outcome they don't want. So it's either you're saying no to something, you have to take something away, they have to transition into an activity they don't want to do. The list is endless. But essentially, they're up against something they don't want to do. So now we have a tantrum on our hands. We have protest, we have crying, whatever it might look like. And so in that moment, I think parents are often asking me, if I hug my child, am I reinforcing the tantrum? And I believe that for me, again, and I understand what you're saying because I do like teaching breaks and I do think those are really important to gain those self-regulation skills. But in that moment of hugging, or if that's a co-regulatory strategy that maybe both of you calm down, I'm not really exactly sure like if even co-regulation is the right word. But as long as the outcome doesn't change, the boundary to me does not get reinforced. Or I'm sorry, the tantrum does not get reinforced. So if you say to your child, hey, you got to put this away. They don't want to put it away. You say, I'm going to take it. We're putting it away. Now they have a big tantrum and they're crying. To me, if you turn around and say, okay, I'll let you play with it for 5 more minutes just this time. But remember, when I have to, and we start to get into some negotiation ourselves because we can't tolerate what's coming up when we see our kids upset or struggling. And so as a result, we start to then offer different things. And now the outcome has changed as a result of their dysregulation. Then we reinforce that, right? Then that child is like, wow, this is really valuable. Every time I go into this state of upset, protest, whatever it looks like, I hold the cards. I have leverage. Something works out in my favor. So that's sort of the idea. But I don't think that if a child is really upset, and I will say to your point, most kids don't want to be hugged in that moment. I have very rarely worked with a child who is really, let's say, strong-willed or has a certain idea of wants to see who has power and who doesn't. When they're dysregulated, I said, go ahead, offer them, say, would you like a hug? They will scream no in your face. They rarely are at a point where they're going to say, yes, actually, that hug's going to feel really good. Now, some kids might. So I just meant it in the capacity of like, if you think a hug will help your child, I think it's okay because at that point, this is my own framing on it, but I don't think we need to punish the emotion that's being expressed. Right. It's that we're just looking to set that boundary, stay consistent, follow through on it, and make sure that the tantrum doesn't result in a changed outcome.
Right. And I think, it's interesting the idea of punish the emotion, right? I don't think a penalty or an effect necessarily is a punishment. I think so. I think it's like if you get pulled over for a speeding ticket, and they just go, "Hey, you were speeding, so you got a ticket, and you got to pay the ticket." There's not, there's a consequence there, but I think it's a punishment when they go, "Hey, that's really bad, and I don't want that kind of thing happening anymore." And you judge the emotion. That's a different experience. So for me, they need to have the cause and effect happen. While you actually take away the judgment of the thing. It's like, hey, if you want to cry, I totally get it. If you're upset and you need some time to regulate, that's normal. That's okay. I'm okay with that. But this has to finish until this happens. And what that happens, when you do that, what we're doing is, and back to what you said about an approach of I don't know, is we don't know if that's a feigned inability or an actual inability. We don't know. We can create a condition where we find that out through setting a boundary and see what happens. And I think partly because the people who call me tend to have kids who are having extreme tantrums, whether they're 3-year-olds or 14-year-olds. I think I was particularly devious in how I learned how to overcome boundaries as a child. So maybe I'm projecting my own deviousness into other children, but I know that it's a solution that works with those kids. And I also worry about like who's training who, because I've seen kids who do that enough where parents then go, I don't really give a lot of breaks because they demand a hug and then they're dysregulated for a long time. And I don't always have 10 minutes to sit and cuddle them. So I don't give the break at all. So they never learn to do the break, and I end up doing accommodations because it's quicker, because I need to get through the day. And if the child's effectively training you that way, then that's a problem. Right.
Right.
You need to get out the door. So anyway.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I like that. And I even like the way you framed it around the idea of like, hey, it's, we're not saying you can't cry. We're not saying you can't be upset. You can do whatever you need to do. As soon as you kind of have this break, this 1 minute time of being able to calm and regulate yourself, let's hug it out. Let's do what we need to do. And I like the fact that there is, the reason I love breaks a lot, I teach it a lot, even when I coach families, I always talk about, I send them the link to your book when they sign on. And one of the things I say is it's not a punishment. And you'll see that quickly when you read your work, that this isn't meant to be like punitive and make them feel bad. And that the idea is the break is really meant to be a self-regulation strategy so that they cannot proceed or do something else until they gain the ability to calm themselves down for that full minute. But what I also love about it is that, and I remind parents of this too, when we are calm and steady while we're letting that happen and we let them get to that point of that 1 minute being able to just regulate themselves, we are saying to them, we trust that you can do this. Right. We trust that you can get through this really hard, difficult moment. You're probably asked this just as much as I am, but I really want my kids to be resilient is something I'm asked very frequently, right? And it's like, oh gosh, well then you got to stop doing a lot of things that you're already, you're probably doing to help them, which I get it. It's all so well intended. I mean, I know I've said this in a workshop. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, it's conflict, difficulty. You want resilience? Okay. So here's your job. If you want a resilient child, because I think we're not doing a good job building resilience right now as a culture. Mm-hmm. You want those things. You need to be okay with conflict. Yes. You need to be okay giving frustration. You need to be okay, giving difficulty. Moments of deprivation. Okay, I want those things to have positive associations with them as much as possible, where you frame them as a protagonist, where you give them their autonomy, where you talk about, look, I can't make you clean your room, but until we clean the room, we're not going on a play date. And maybe that means you miss the play date. I respect that decision. So in that language, I see you. I respect you. I don't judge your choice. However, this very difficult, frustrating deprivation is what you're moving into. And I'm okay with that because I think you can survive it. That builds resilience.
Exactly.
So realize that if you're moving those things, if you're orchestrating the day so that you're not doing the things that they have difficulty with that you want to do or that you'd like them to do, and you're avoiding these big tantrums, you're not doing them any favors. They're going to get in the world, and the world's not going to move for them like that, and they're going to be filled with anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say that I was hosting a workshop not that long ago, and I shared this. It's from the movie Ray, the story about Ray Charles, and it shows his childhood when and I don't remember much about the movie other than this one scene really stuck with me, but he's a child and he's beginning to lose his sight. Right. And he's walking through his home, and it's him and his mom, and he falls down, and now he's struggling to get back up, right? And it's just this gut-wrenching scene because he can't see, and this is new to him, and he's trying to figure out how to grab himself onto something and pull himself back up, but he can't reach a piece of furniture, and he's crying out to his mom to help him. And it's like it's so gutting because as the parent, all she wants to do is go over and pick him up and plant him on his feet, right? And she stops herself and she just stands there and lets it happen. And he struggles and struggles, and then he latches onto the couch, and then he latches onto something else, and then slowly but surely he gets right back on his 2 feet and he stands back up and he can move again. And so to me, like when I said in this workshop, often parents have this very idyllic idea of what these sort of beautiful moments of parenting are like holding hand, being hand in hand and walking through the park and conversations and all these bonding moments. And those are beautiful and wonderful. And you will have those moments with your kids. But to me, the most loving thing was what that mother did in that moment, right? Was being able to say, this is the hardest thing I'll ever have to do is to watch him struggle like this. But I know if I want him to be able to navigate this world in the best version of himself, I have to let him go through this hard moment and figure out how to get back on his feet. And so
I would say, first of all, look, what you just described tells me you have very good instincts about what human happiness is.
Yeah.
Because this is at the core of a lot of our misunderstanding, because we live in a society where we think we can avoid aging and death, where we can avoid pain, where we can avoid difficulty, where we should avoid anything that triggers a bad feeling. but that doesn't lead to happiness. So when you talk about that moment and the difference between that walking hand in hand through a field of flowers while they're treating you with love and respect, and that perfect moment, and the moment when you have to hold the pain of watching them be frustrated toward an end instead of going and solving their problem. This actually speaks to what research says is the core of human happiness. And there's a book called Flow by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, a Chicago professor, and he studied human happiness throughout the world. And what he found was, contrary to popular belief, people don't remember the moments when they're on a beach with a margarita. Okay,
Right.
they're getting a massage. They remember moments, and they feel the most satisfaction from moments when they had to struggle with their own unique abilities that sometimes were discovered in those moments to solve a problem and end, particularly one that relates to themselves contributing to other people or the community. Those are moments of flow when your best is being brought out, and it's typically moments of pain, of difficulty, and you make it through. We have to allow and hold that space. So what you saw in the Ray Charles movie is the embodiment of someone being able to develop a relationship that then would serve them throughout their life with the world, with their own conflict. It's not solving the problem. It's not the love and kindness of somebody just giving you what you want and you not having to overcome it. And it ties right back to resilience. So I would say, hats off. That's a good metaphor, and it shows a certain core instinct that's right on the mark.
Well, I appreciate that. But yeah, I agree with everything you just said completely. I mean, I know myself, having raised two kids now who are now adults. One's going to graduate college soon, and the other is a freshman in college. And those were the hardest moments, but the moments I think my husband and I are the most proud of is when we sort of sat back and we saw it real clearly. We're like, oh, we know we know what's going to happen here. It's not going to end well. And we just let it happen. And it was so hard, right? I mean, I can still think of moments where it was like, but we knew it was exactly what they needed. And I can tell you now that it's in my rearview mirror, it was exactly that. And it was things that helped them grow and become stronger. And they became more courageous. They had more self-assurance. They could face things differently each time we allowed those moments to happen, and we didn't jump in and sort of create a soft landing every time. So is it hard? Absolutely. Do you learn a lot about yourself in the process? Yes. But do you actually give them the tools they need to succeed? You do. So it's a good lesson. It's important. But yeah, it's definitely hard.
Yeah. It sounds like, you had an instinct also for pairing those things with positive language and emotion about their autonomy, giving them respect, allowing them to learn, allowing them to make the mistake. Because I think that those associations with difficulty, it's not just give them difficulty, give them deprivation. It's what associations can you help bring to them? Can they think of themselves as a protagonist in the world? Someone responsible for the outcomes and having power over those outcomes so that they can make those decisions and drive things. If they can think that way about those difficulties, you have a happy, resilient person moving forward.
Yeah. I love that. I want to piggyback off of that because you had posted something and I loved it. It was about this idea of parents who struggle to set boundaries, and you connected it to sort of how the associations they made when boundaries were placed on them when they were younger. And I think it's a lot of what you've sort of mentioned already, this idea of like pairing judgment with, some of the things that we're telling our kids, we're assigning judgments when we don't need to. We can just state the boundary with neutrality and set the expectation. So can you elaborate on that a little bit in terms of the boundaries and why parents struggle?
Yeah, well, I think, when you have a child, something happens with you where all of those emotions of you as a child come to the surface, It's one of the wonderful things about working with difficult children for me is that, I love the experience and I love those children because those fiercely difficult children reflect things that went on with me as a child. And so there's a chance to resolve certain feelings and let them go through it in a way that I didn't go through it. But the first instinct is typically when you're thrown into parenthood, which is just to do sometimes on an unconscious level, to do the opposite of what happened to you or replicate what happened to you. But
Mhm.
this doesn't really acknowledge that the child in front of you has a different experience going on. So that's where, which literally we are parenting the child. Maybe literally is not the word, but emotionally we are parenting the child inside of us in those moments instead of the child in front of us. So I'll give you an example. As I've worked with a couple of people, one woman I can think of who had a father who was an alcoholic, who was aggressive, who was violent, and she learned her place in that family system was to anticipate the conflict and then to create distractions and reasons and activities that would move the conflict away and change it before it hit, and then everything blew up. So she was kind of this peacemaker, proactive peacemaker. And then when she had her son, when the conflict would come up, she would do the same thing. But her son, she had, didn't have any desire to be a peacemaker. He had a desire to answer this question of, do you have power? Are you like me? Particularly because, his father had left. So he was really who's in charge here? And she was left with a large part of that burden. And so every time she tried to move away from that conflict and solve things before it got to the conflict moment, his anxious need to solve that problem got higher. So by the time he was 3, he was incredibly aggressive, would hit her, would threaten, would demand, was really dysregulated because she couldn't answer that question. Now she was living out that part. And I think she came to that awareness before she called me. And she said, I know this is going on and I need some coaching around what it would look like if I didn't have that internal memory and that instinct. And in some ways that instinct served her well in the rest of the world. Incredibly empathetic person, but in terms of that parenting, it caused a problem she knew she had to evolve out of. So for her, it was learning to set boundaries that she could do and follow through, and I was able to model a lot of that for her, and then she was able to repeat that or see how the reaction that he would have with me, and then she was able to incorporate that into her own persona. And ended up with a really lovely, well-regulated, respectful, still very strong-willed, but brilliant boy.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, I've worked with people in similar situations, and I agree with you. I mean, I've worked with strong-willed kids. I've worked with kids who are, quote-unquote defiant. And one of the first things I say, even on the videos that I post, is I don't think there's anything wrong with being defiant. We have to look at it differently. When I was doing treatment, more often than not, the kids that were a little more strong-willed or defiant were placed on my caseload because I really learned a lot from them and I loved working with them. And like you, I felt like there was something about them that I felt like was so admirable. Like they made you really work for it, and there wasn't this ease. They were like, we don't care who you are and what degrees you have, get over yourself. And so I always appreciated it. And I did always feel the same way as you, that actually what they're asking for is quite simple. It's just we overcomplicate it and we make it more, and we just, oh no, and I have a child that's this, and we start to pathologize everything. And at the end of the day, that's exactly what you're saying. They have a question, they need it resolved, and they want to know who has power in any given situation. And we have to really be the ones to show them that they're safe and that we hold the same amount of power, if not more, certainly while they're younger. And it's on us to really be comfortable expressing those boundaries in a way that they need to have them expressed. Right. So I love that. I wanted to ask you about this comes up a lot too. That's why I made all these notes that I was like, I'm going to get Joe Newman's advice on this. But I have a lot of parents, and I call this process being team kid. But I think it's similar to some of the things that you've shared on your videos as well and in your newsletters. But I was working with a mother, and she was trying to set boundaries around how she was going to get her child to leave a park. And I used to go through this when my kids were younger too, but he would kick and scream and he wouldn't want to leave. And, there were challenges around that. And the other problem she was having with him was that he would hit or be physical with the other kids in play. So it wasn't that he was aggressively trying to punch a child, but that he would be really he wouldn't be able to keep hands to himself. So I told her, when you go to the park, if talk to him about it ahead of time and let him know that as soon as if you end up hitting somebody or pushing somebody at the park, we're just going to leave, right? And then it's got to be sort of a swift. We can't have long conversations about it. It's just got to be the action has to be attached to whatever the situation is. So if he's hitting, you're not waiting, you're not pulling him out, giving him 10 reminders, you're not trying to come up with different ideas in that moment. You just got to go through it at that point. So she said, okay, perfect. So when he starts to cry then in the car when we're leaving, can I just remind him at that point, it's because of him that he's that upset and he's the reason we're leaving the park. And there was like this, what she was getting at and what I was hearing her say is that I really want to make sure he knows I didn't do anything wrong. It was because he didn't listen that we actually have to leave the park. He's the reason he's enduring the consequence. And I said to her, there's nothing wrong with what you're suggesting, but what if you simply just held the boundary, didn't get caught up in being right or gaining agreement? Because I think most parents want agreement from their kids when they set boundaries, where the truth is they don't have to agree with us. They just have to figure out how to do the thing we're asking them to do, but they don't have to like it, right? That's not the same thing. And so I said, what if you get in the car and he's crying, and instead of you going into your justification of like, you're right and he's the one who's wrong, what if you just said, you know what, honey, today it was hard, but I think tomorrow you're gonna be able to do it.
Yeah. See, what you just said there's an entirely different thing implied with how you responded than how she was responding, which is that when you explain afterwards, inevitably you're adding a judgment.
Yes.
And you're saying that what you did was not rational. Okay. And I would argue what he did is rational, that he has a pattern of things that have happened. And he, as any good scientist, he knows that 9 out of 10 times she doesn't follow through with what she's doing to frustrate him. Okay. And she doesn't understand that he needs to challenge that boundary because he's trying to resolve something, or else she wouldn't treat it as rational and try and explain why she's the right one and he's the wrong one. What you said was you held an expectation. It's basically you said, tomorrow you'll figure it out or you won't, but I'm okay. This takes time. And that's a very different kind of unanxious and it's also about approval. She's trying to think that rational explanations that she's going to give based on approval and disapproval of what's right and wrong is going to control his behavior. Now, you've got some kids that are motivated by approval and disapproval, but more and more kids are motivated by power. What works? They're smart. They're scientists. We've raised them with a lot of attention and articulation, and they're building models about what works, what doesn't work. So if you say no and they're going the opposite direction, a big part of that is that their research has shown them that 9 out of 10 times they can work their way around a no. So no doesn't mean no. It means, 10% chance that this is going to be frustrating. So you get them in the car and then you tell them how they're bad, which is essentially what you're doing. You're just adding judgment to that process and more reason to defy you. So, I think that, solving that problem, I would think about it first. There was a great expression I read once, it was like in Men's Health magazine or something about training. And, I think I ran a triathlon years ago, and I used to do a lot of different stuff. And it said, never do on game day what you haven't done in practice. So don't try and do breaks for the first time at a park when you hit somebody.
Yes.
If you can't do them at home. Do them at home when nobody's watching, when you're more likely not to be mortified and be able to follow through. Follow that pattern. Do them if you have a partner, do them with your partner. If you have a good friend who can support you, do them with your friend. But do them in the place where you can most likely satisfy and finish going through that with the least amount of anxiety. Don't start it on a plane. Don't start it in a park. Don't start it in an expensive restaurant. Let's start at home and set a pattern. First, set a pattern. Second, when you go to the park, make a plan. Like, okay, this is the day when he hits, and I'm not going to wait till the third person he hits or the time when he really hits him in the face. I'm gonna go, I need you to take a break. You're going to count. He's not going to take the break. That's not going to happen. You're not attached. And then you're going to pick him up and take him to the car and go home and go, dude, I know it's a frustrating day. you'll figure it out tomorrow, which is what you suggested in the
Yeah.
beginning. So,
Yeah. No, I love that. I love that. I know I did the same thing. I've taught parents to do the same thing. Like if they're not doing it in the home setting, the likelihood that you're going to see the outcome you want in public is slim to none.
Right.
So, right. So you'll get parents who will say, what do you do if the tantrum is in public? And I'll say, do they have tantrums at home? And they'll say yes. And I'll say, well, there's no reason why they won't have them in public, right? If anything, they might have an even bigger one in public because being the scientists that they are, you're probably more likely to concede in public, understandably so, right? Maybe you're in a time constraint. You have to pick up this one item for dinner
Children
and you
know
just
how
have to get through
embarrass
it.
you. And when you're easily,
Right.
you're easy to embarrass.
Right. So they sense and feel. They're like, ooh, I got a little more power when we're at Target. So
Yeah.
I'm going to see how that shakes out. And, for a lot of kids, they're going to try. And I think our frustration and then our, it sort of continues and our anxiousness around it. And we tend to do what I call like anticipatory anxiety, which is that every time, you start your day, you're thinking of all the pitfalls or where it's going to go wrong. And instead, what if you just went into it just a little more optimistic and thought, whatever happens, happens. I'll handle it and so will they.
Yes,
right. And
yes.
just get
Or
yourself to
detach
feel
from
a
that
little more.
outcome.
Yeah.
I had a mom
exactly.
who had a Target problem, right? Which was
Yeah.
that she would go to Target and her 2.5-year-old had an instinct for when the cart was exactly half full and she was in the middle of the store, and that's when she started to demanding things. And I said, you need to go to Target one day where you actually don't need anything, or you're okay
Yes.
doing a cart abandonment in the middle of the store, walking out with her screaming and yelling and taking her home.
Yeah.
Set a precedent.
I've done the exact same thing. I've told parents the exact same thing. You have to test run. You got to do a test run because this way now you can follow through. You don't really need anything and your anxiety level will stay more reduced because you'll be able to know like, okay, the second they engage in the behavior I don't want them to, I'll be able to, like you said, abandon the cart, leave, whatever the case is. And, then once kids, back to that idea of being scientists, once you can do that a few times, it's all it really takes.
Yeah.
And then if you just stay consistent, it's amazing how quickly it turns around. When I was in treatment with this one little boy, he always wanted his mom in the room, and he had a lot of different sort of challenges, but the idea was like we needed to get mom to sort of not be in the room so that he could connect with the things I was needing him to do.
Right.
And I wanted to see what he would do if he didn't have her in the room in terms of behaviors. And so we had observation rooms so she could watch the whole time, and she was sitting on the other side of the mirror. So we talked about it. I said, listen, I'm going to have you sit in the observation room. He's going to cry a lot and he's going to get really mad that we're doing this because it's not on his terms. It's not what he wants. It's okay. Anything he does, I said, I don't want you to say anything. You're going to feel tempted to come in and stop him, to tell him to behave better, to not do this, not do that. I said, I give you my word, it will not even last that long. I said, just trust me. She said, okay. So we walk in, she goes and sits and watches. So the session was 30 minutes. He cried a lot, screamed a lot, and he did a lot of things. He tried scratching, he tried spitting, he tried pushing the table back. He got up, he threw a couple toys. We did a little of everything. And after 10 minutes, he sat down and he said, and the kids used to call me Ona, and he sat down and he goes, okay, Ona, what's next? And then we just got to work and we did 25 minutes of really good therapy. So
don't you love that
the point
moment?
Yes,
that moment.
That
where it's
moment.
Like, they're almost like, all right, well, I tried all my things.
Yes.
It was a nice game. Let's move on now. It's like,
Right.
you can't blame a guy
Right.
for trying.
Exactly. And even the mom, she came in and she's like, I was dying in that 10 minutes. I'm sure it felt like an eternity to her.
Yeah.
And she said, and when he just sat up on the chair and this goes, okay, like, what's next? Like, what are we doing? And he just got to work. And she goes, makes me think of all the times at home that I've probably reacted too quickly, solved it too quickly, fixed it too quickly because I didn't like what was happening and I just wanted it to stop. So, sometimes you got to just let it happen.
Right.
It's hard.
No, I love
Yeah.
that.
And
That's a great
just stick to your boundary. I know but there are so many like that, right? But it's obviously easier said than done. So I know we're coming up on time. So I just wanted to ask you one more question around this idea of, and we've touched on it a little bit today, but how would you help a parent who is working with a child who is struggling to tolerate any frustration, right? Any, the minute the answer is no to something, the minute they don't get their way. This comes up a lot, like losing in games, insisting that games are played the way they want to play them, insisting that they're first in line all the time. There's just a lot of this is how it appears to me is that there's a struggle to tolerate frustration. There is a desire to be the one in power. So, in order to quell sort of whatever anxiousness comes up when they think they might not have the power, they sort of double down. And there is a lot of, I'm first, I'm going to be, and there is a lot of kind of what we would call bossy behavior. So, how would you sort of help a parent unpack that, or where would you start?
So, I'd start by understanding that I'd explain to them that the children are doing two different things in those conflicts, and those conflicts aren't really about their inability to tolerate certain things. That the conflicts are really about is to answering this fundamental question. Are you like me, who has power? And they're going to do that in two ways: active tantrums, demands, refusals. Not being able to, saying what they want, being relentless, badgering, etc., cheating, disrespect. And then they're going to do it in the more difficult aspect, which is when you set boundaries around that, they're going to feign inability. And that's going to be a passive tantrum. So they're going to use both tools to avoid the cause and effect relationship that exists in the natural world that they're kind of trying to sort out the rules to. And so if you want to succeed, first of all, realize your children are scientists, and that you need to have a plan where you're going to repeat these boundaries that are done in a non-punitive way, that give autonomy, but allow that frustration to happen over and over again through a week. And that the first time you do it, probably the first 3 or 5 times you do it, it's going to go badly. It may even escalate. That's a natural, healthy response. Well,
totally.
I'm going to double down on these things. So if you abandon it, or you think, I didn't say it right the first time, it's like, if you have a problem with your kid's behavior and you want them to calm down, so you hire me to fly with you on the plane, I'm not going to have good results. I'm going to have crappy results. All my magic talk, all my good tone, all my special words, meaningless. They work because they're repeated and they gradually change the relationship. So start on a Saturday morning when there's a number of activities that that they want to do. Hold those boundaries, allow them to fail, allow them to have a bad day, and be as nice about it as you possibly can. And don't take it all out away at once. Just like, look, you need to finish this before this starts. You might not finish it till halfway into that activity, and half of it will be gone. I'm okay with that. Repeat, continue. Allow them to have a bad day, and be nice about it. I know it's frustrating. Don't judge it. Tomorrow we'll try again. Do it again, and do it in a time when you're comfortable to follow through with those things. You can see a profound change in 48 hours if you do that. I often do a home visit, and I see a profound change in 2 hours, because we come in and I tell them, look, there's going to be a conflict in the first 10 minutes. It's going to get loud and upsetting, and we're going to move through it, and we're going to keep repeating that, and you'll see an adjustment happening 2 hours later.
Yeah, I love it. I know, I completely agree with you. It can happen so fast, but you need that patterning. You need the repetition. You need them to see the consistency that, like, your answers are, your boundary is the same. What you do is the same in those moments. And the results are pretty stunning. Kids are quick learners. They know how to adjust. They know how to be flexible, even despite what you might think. And it's usually us. It's always us. Yeah. No one wants to hear that.
As much as that may seem anxiety producing to think about doing a weekend like that, and as difficult as watching that frustration and holding that boundary is, you should reassure yourself by understanding that your child's waiting for that day. They're waiting, and when you're able to do that, you will become real to them in a way that they can love you, that a 5-year-old should love them. A 15-year-old can love. You're going to set mutual recognition in place in a way that will feel more intimate, and you'll get a deeper response over the next weeks and months than you've ever seen before, and that cycle that you've been stuck in will end.
Yeah. And isn't that the dream, right? Yeah. So, well, Joe, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to put everything in the show notes in terms of where people can find you, but where is the best place to connect with you?
Go to raisinglions.com. Raisinglions.com. You can set up a consult with me, or you can do a discovery call and find out what's next. And, I can hear a little bit your situation and give you any quick tips. You can join a Q&A that happens at least once a month with a group of other parents. And these are typically fairly small groups of 10-ish. And you can learn a lot from other parents in the same situation and get a lot of solutions that you can put in action right away. I have a TikTok, I have a Instagram,
Yeah.
and what else? Yeah, there's a Facebook page.
Yeah, I love it. All the places. Yes, head to raisinglions.com for sure. Follow Joe on his social media platforms. He gives great, insightful tips and honestly a very short amount of time. It doesn't take, your videos are really concise. They're really great to watch. I've certainly learned so much from you. So I'm so grateful, and I know so many people will get so much out of your work. So please keep coming back on the podcast. We love having you.
It is always a pleasure.
Thank you. Love having you here. Bye-bye.
Thank you.